there, I'm Kate with the Creative Coast, and welcome to Lunchtime Topics. If you haven't been to one of these before, Lunchtime Topics is a program of our 501c3 nonprofit, the Creative Coast, and it exists to educate the startup and innovative community in Savannah, Georgia. And the Creative Coast, we are as I said, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we exist to catalyze the innovation economy. So thank you for being here today. Each episode, we bring on a different business expert who shares their wisdom with the startup and innovative community. Today's guest is Matthew Mottola. Matthew is the co-founder and CEO of The Human Cloud, a company that empowers leaders to make sense of, test, and scale unique freelance applications so their organizations can create new products, services, unlock cost efficiencies, and access sustainable talent pipelines. So, in fact, he co-wrote the book called The Human Cloud, which was published by HarperCollins and listed as the #1 international new release. For 10 plus years, he's helped leaders embrace digital first, remote first, and freelance first talent models across enterprise environments. He's helped 100 plus enterprises hire freelancers at scale, spoken across 75 plus international stages, been nominated a top 50 remote work expert to follow, and featured in Forbes and Fortune, just to name a few. So Matthew, we're so excited to get into the questions today and talk to you about this lunchtime topic, the freelance economy. And I thank you for being here.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. And I think an interesting angle for you and the audience as well, on top of just the kind of generic, boring business bullets, right, is I've been fortunate to live in now, what's it been, 6 different cities and 2 different countries because of the whole tech and entrepreneur and startup journey. And so Savannah is the first that we've said, hey, we choose to live here for the life, not necessarily go wherever the tech opportunity is. And I've been able to do San Francisco, Seattle, Singapore, Miami, which when we lived there, I didn't know it was a tech hub, but it became one as we lived there for the year and a half. But yeah, so super excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. Yeah, Matthew just relocated here not too long ago, and we're super excited to have him here. He's one of these hidden gems living in Savannah that moved here in the last few years. I think the pandemic pushed a lot of people. They realized, hey, I can live anywhere I want. I'm not staying in this tiny apartment in New York City or wherever it may be. I'm going to go down south and where there's a little bit lower cost of living, I guess. And he mentioned choosing Savannah. We've got our website, choosesav.com, but we're just glad to have you here, and excited to have new people in Savannah with innovative ideas, and thankful to have you be a part of the community. So thank you for being here. And I want to get into your background a little bit more. So I shared, those kind of bullet points of those major accomplishments you've had. You've got a really impressive resume. Can you tell us more about your background and what led you to write The Human Cloud, start this business? Why are you passionate about this subject?
Yeah, it's so funny to me, the boring bullets. I always like to say in business, and usually I've noticed in corporate leadership decks, there's always a first page of the family. So I used to always make fun of like leaders in corporate, like, you keep exploiting your children, right? Like every second slide or first slide about me, there was always like their children and whatever partners. And I don't have that, to be honest. I'm about to be 30, and so I guess I'm starting to be able to have that. But so my background, I like to say I got very lucky in being exposed to the freelance economy before most people even knew what a freelancer was. So I started freelancing 10 plus years ago, started doing it in college, actually, because I couldn't work full time. And I saw it more than just, hey, there's this cute little thing that I can do. And instead, wow, this is a generational change in how we should be working. And so I've kind of stayed on that forever. I've been fortunate to do this in a bunch of different environments. So I built Microsoft's freelance toolkit, built a venture-backed company, got it to acquisition, which is what most recently I had done. And then the Human Cloud, honestly, it's just when you're part of something, you end up doing all of the things within that. And so within this space of the freelance economy, I've been a freelancer, I've helped companies hire freelancers, and then built the software around that. So it kind of, I always like to say, it's like a dog chasing its own tail. And then the book was, all right, let's make sure everyone knows about this. And it's funny, we published it pre-COVID. I think it came out January 2021, but we handed it over a month before COVID happened. So COVID had catalyzed this industry, but the future of work was already going to be freelance first. It's just that COVID kind of made it easier for us to be able to talk about it. I think you're on mute, Caitlin.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so kind of perfect timing with not to say the pandemic was a good thing, but it changed a lot of things. And Interesting to see how, the world has shifted. And I want to get into that a little bit more because the numbers are trending that more and more people are moving to freelance. But before we do that, um, for the purpose of the podcast and anyone new to this subject, just occasionally we have people that are listening in and, they're curious about a subject, but don't know about as much about it. Can you talk about or describe what is the freelance economy exactly?
Oh, it's so funny. There's so many buzzwords that we use. And even with the book, The Human Cloud, it wasn't, we didn't write the book with the name The Human Cloud in place. It was actually made, I think a couple of weeks before sending it over to the publishers. And it was made on a whim where we were talking with one of the people in our industries and they said, just name it The Human Cloud. We were like, oh, okay, that sounds good. And sure enough, I think it actually is one of the best ways to describe this because when we say freelance, there's so many different definitions, there's so many different applications, and it's almost like this massive word that can describe something very specific or absolutely nothing all at the same time. All we really are talking about is a technology change that makes it easier to work on a project basis, usually in a remote first manner. And so when someone says, I am a freelancer, generally what that means is they're not tied down to one employer in a physical location. That at its core, that's really what we're talking about. What it means for business leaders is that instead of prioritizing full-time employees for everything or going through agencies for everything else, you are able to work directly with designers, developers, researchers, writers, you name it, on a contract basis, and technology has made it easier to create that transaction. And so instead of saying, hey, we need a writer to create 6 blog posts a month, let's go hire a full-time writer, it's okay, let's go find a freelancer to write 1 article. And then if we really like that person, guess what? They might take on 6. And so a lot of times freelancers actually look no differently than full-time employees. The difference is just that how you met and how you got started working is a lot more technology enabled than just saying, okay, let's hire a full-time employee.
That's, the Creative Coast, that's how we operate. I'm the only full-time employee, and everybody else, even our executive director, is a contract freelance worker. Because we have that case is, in this content heavy world, where, they say, I don't know if people are saying this anymore, but content is king. It's like, for us, we need blogs, we need photos, we need video, we need, a press release, we need a graphic designer, but we don't need all those things all the time. And so being, for us, one of the advantages is being able to say like, okay, we don't need a full-time graphic designer, but we need someone X number of hours a week. And that works for them. It works for us. So, okay. There's one thing you talk about in your book. Your book talks about how AI and the freelance economy work together to transform work without giving too much away. Can you elaborate on what that means or looks like?
Yeah. So when we say AI, and let me make sure I acknowledge, so my co-author is a man named Matt Coatney. He's a CTO/CIO, was an early deep learning expert. And so he was the one really taking the baton and saying, how in the world does AI actually affect work? And if we're being honest, AI affects it in very simple ways. We're not talking about, I think we have fallen in love in the past couple of years with crypto, blockchain, Web3, all these various terms, when in reality, all we're doing is automating inefficiencies that are getting in the way of us being able to work. And so the way we look at the book, and that we look at honestly where work is going, is that the individual has never been more important and will only become more important the more that technology transforms. And so when we look at the freelance economy, we say it's literally just a technology that better matches individuals with opportunities. And that goes on both ends. It better matches clients with the people that they need to get stuff done, and it better matches individuals with the clients that they want to work with. Now, when we talk about AI, AI is really just automating the inefficiencies for everything in the way of that. And it sounds so simple, but literally just a calendar integration where instead of having to contact an agency to then see if someone is available, you can literally just say, oh, let me find Matthew's Calendly link, hop on a meeting with him, and if I like him, send over a contract through PandaDoc, And that contract will have classification requirements built in, which prior you needed an agency for. And so we say AI, in reality, it's just simple automation for things that have made work so inefficient, which usually is just getting in the way of individuals being able to do their best work. And so I can't stress enough, it really is simple, but we've had 150 plus years of inefficiencies just building on top of each other in work. And so within the human cloud, it's really just taking those away and putting the worker at the center.
Got it. So here's an example on our end. I was gonna bring up your Calendly because I noticed that when we first set up our first meeting, and a lot of people use that to just to get rid of the back and forth and all that, little banter that doesn't need to happen. So at the Creative Coast, we use something called Grammarly for our writers, which, it's been great because if we have multiple brands, and when I can go in and put in rules, it takes me like maybe 10 minutes or so, and then it automates what can and can't be said across those brands for those writers. So we've got writers who are all over, and all over Savannah, not all over Georgia or the country, but we have writers all over, and that way it kind of keeps everybody in line and consistent. I mean, that's kind of what you're talking about, right? Those little things like that. Or we use Gusto as a payment system. So okay, so let's talk about for startups. What are some of the biggest advantages for startups to hire freelancers?
That's a good question. So usually there's three major values that we see, and this is startups and enterprise. The first is just genuinely access. If you're sitting in the middle of Wisconsin, how in the world are you going to get access to good developers, data scientists, designers, you name it? And so within freelance networks, you have access to over 100 million individuals globally that can do exactly what you need. So that's the first one. The second thing is usually flexibility. And so as a startup, things are going to change daily. In an enterprise, they're going to change quarterly, but when a startup, they're going to change daily. If you have full-time employees, you can't just redistribute them. And you usually spend more time organizing work than just getting the right people to work on what you need. And so flexibility in being able to not work with someone, or only work with someone for a day or a week or a month, and then not be tied down to having them on a full-time contract. And it's very important for me to say, because I'm always freelance first, is that it's actually better for the individual as well. And so just because you're working for a couple of days or a week or a month with someone doesn't mean that the individual is getting exploited, right? Or getting treated poorly. Freelancers build that into our workflow. We understand that we are very flexible for you. And so that's, the first two. And then the third thing is always cost, right? It always comes down to cost efficiency. And I just want to make sure I emphasize, this doesn't mean freelancers get paid less. In fact, in a lot of cases, freelancers make 2 or 3 times their income when they're contracting instead of being a full-time employee. And you still might be paying more per hour or per day, or potentially even per whatever that outcome is. The difference is they can do it in days or weeks or months, whereas full-time or agencies, you're going to be stuck with 6 to 12-month contracts.
Got it. So on your website, going back to those numbers, when we were talking about them trending up, on your website, you mentioned that 35% of today's workforce is made up of freelancers, and that number is expected to grow by 2027 to over half the workforce being made up of freelancers. So, I mean, we can talk about the pandemic and why there's this upward trend. I'm assuming the pandemic had something to do with this, but what's going on there?
Yeah, there's so many different numbers. And I feel like what's really tough, actually, and I shouldn't say this as like an industry insider, but a lot of times if a report comes from industry publications, have a grain of salt with it. So the most important numbers that I look at, though, is that the freelance economy right now is a $5.4 trillion industry. It was a $1.2 trillion industry not too long ago. And there's different ways to kind of slice off what that means, but just think about it in that way. Another big data point that came from HBR, right, not in Upwork or Fiverr industry publication, is that 90% of leaders are prioritizing freelancers. And then a report that came from Mercer said that around 67% of leaders are expecting to use freelancers instead of full-time workers. I look at those 3 data points, and that's more important to me than the number of freelancers there are, the growth in freelancers, because the reality is that for most situations, a freelance workflow is more desirable than working full-time, if, when it comes down to income and flexibility. And so those are the big numbers that I focus on. We can dive back into why every single time when you look at this, you see that it comes down to control and choice and flexibility. Depends on who you talk to. It's one of the big problems is that if we say freelancer, well, who are we talking about, right? Are we talking about writers, designers, developers? Everyone's so different. But those are the big things that I focus on, is the fact that there's this $5.4 trillion industry now. 90% of leaders are prioritizing, and 67% of leaders have gone up and said, we're actually going to prioritize contractors over FTEs right now.
Got it. Okay, so from the hiring standpoint, when I think about some of the drawbacks to freelancing, so I freelanced for a while, and I often hear about and this was something that I've been affected by, is not having insurance and benefits. And I'm not familiar with the different, the regulations and laws out there, obviously, but are there platforms or systems that freelancers can turn to, or startups can turn to refer their companies to get them, low cost health insurance or lower cost, or how can companies provide benefits and insurance, stuff like that?
Yeah, so this is where I would separate it. If you are a leader looking to hire freelancers, as much as I don't want to say this, I wouldn't spend your time thinking about the freelancer side in terms of do they have the right health insurance? Do they have the right benefits? Not because you don't care, just because it's taken care of by somebody else. I don't think there's too much in the way of that. If you're the corporate leader focused on hiring freelancers, there's significant risk in the way of doing that. And that risk comes down to the actual company profile. If you're an enterprise, meaning 10,000 plus employees, there is significant classification, legal, security, data privacy, a bunch of different risks. The answer for that is you partner. Very few 10,000 plus enterprises work directly with freelancers or contractors. Most likely they're going through some sort of vendor. And that vendor can be, an MBO partners, that vendor can be Upwork Enterprise, but there's a vendor. If you are the individual freelancer when it comes to health insurance and benefits and all these other options, there are ones out there. There are specifically independent contractor focused insurance. To be honest with you, it takes a lot of individual responsibility, because you are going to be the ones that is managing. What does your monthly budget look like? What do your expenses look like? You are going to have to pay more for health insurance. Getting a house is going to be more difficult. Good luck telling a bank that, look at my 1099s. It's going to be more difficult. And I like to say, though, unfortunately, it just comes down to more individual responsibility. But that'd be the quick answer. If you're a corporate leader, focus on partner. Don't necessarily worry about, hey, I'm working with this individual and I have to handle all the contracts.
Okay. All right. So let's talk recession, because there's a lot of talk about it. And, I think a lot of, you're talking about the numbers and we just went over, but is the recession predicted to affect freelancing and affect those numbers at all? What's happening there?
Yeah, the quick answer is it requires more usage of contractors. That's the core answer. What we've seen from our clients is that is true. And what generally happens is there's an initial budget freeze, and then there's a hiring freeze. And then it turns into what creative strategies can we use to get people in the door to do the work? Because the work still has to happen. It's just a question of who's going to do it. And so what we've seen in a recession is there's going to be more contractors. If this was a 10 years ago recession, I would say it's going to be an incremental increase, and the increase is going to be more in temps and in agencies. But since in COVID, we've seen COVID was a massive catalyst in just the usage of contractors without formal processes. It was literally just, let's get people in the building to get this work done. And so because of that, there's now more of a formal process in working with independent contractors. So from a recession perspective, yeah, we're seeing more usage. With that said, the usage is because you need to find creative strategies to get work out of the building. And typically that looks like, so freelancers and independent contractors, they're generally viewed under procurement, meaning they're looked at as buying a service or buying some sort of other It's a typical procurement spend. It's a
Mhm.
lot easier to get that out the door than it is to get a full-time hire.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about your other endeavor. You're also the founder of Venture L. Can you talk about what this platform does and provides?
Yeah, so we sold Venturel. Venturel
Yeah. Okay.
was, yeah, so this is where I always bounce in between. I need to just like cut it and focus on one. I always, at core, I'm a freelancer, but then I'm always helping companies hire freelancers and bridging that gap. Because usually, I'll give some quick context. If you take 100 freelancers, I'd say 80 to 90 are struggling. They are not making a predictable income. They are not having comparable results to their full-time job. Most likely, they are in what we could call the gig economy and not doing too well. The 10% was what we were focusing on Venturel, was how do we make the best practices of that 10% available to everyone using software. And we spent 2 years basically pounding our head against a wall, figuring out what a freelance business really comes down to. And when we say freelance business, I do want to be very specific. We're talking about professional service. So we're not talking about owning a hot dog stand, right? We're not talking about building a construction business. We're talking about a professional service firm that's usually 1 to 5 people and is done fully remote. But so what we learned through Venturel was that the scalability of independence usually comes down to their network, specifically the ability to collaborate or subcontract work to.
Mhm.
And that is what enables them to get larger contracts, which larger contracts usually mean having 2 to 5 clients, 20 to $50,000 a month coming in. And we built a lot of the software for that. So yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, we had someone else come on a lunchtime topic, Jamie, and she talked about, when you're starting a freelancing, how you often take all the clients, you take the clients that aren't the best. They're not paying the best, and they also demand the most of you, and you learn pretty quick. If I'm going to do this much work, I need to raise my prices. So that's interesting too, that you've got that software. I didn't even know that was out there. That's awesome. Um,
There's
so
plenty of them, by the way. So that's where I do want to acknowledge, Venturel was not, what we really did learn was that software is great, but a spreadsheet is good enough. And what's really hard is getting the contracts and unlocking the budget within large companies. And unfortunately, it still is very, very manual. And
uh-huh.
so even though there's 1,000 plus platforms out there, there's Upwork, there's Fiverr, there's Paro for finance and account, like there's 1,000 plus of these platforms. They do serve a good purpose, which is to go unlock budget for good contracts. And no matter how good a freelancer you are, it's really tough to go win a contract from a Microsoft, from a Deloitte, from an Accenture. That's large. And so that's where we kind of learned with Venturel, as much as we really love helping the individual freelancer, it's very painful. It's not necessarily profitable. And the good freelancers, a spreadsheet was good enough.
Okay. Okay. Well, we're about to close out here, and when we sign off, we're gonna ask Angela here, who's on, if she has any questions. But I also wanted to, leave the floor open to you for a little bit. If there's anything I didn't cover, or you felt like, you wanted to mention before we close out here, Matthew, let me know. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I would just add, as we come into, we're already, depends on who you talk to, right? We're already in a recession. And we've
Mhm.
had a bunch of other forces that past recessions haven't had to deal with. So for example, there still is a great resignation. Talent's never had more control and ability to tell employers to go pound sand if the employers aren't providing what they want. And especially when you look at the younger generations, if you look at Gen Z and millennials, they are full bore adopting flexible work, whether that means freelance, remote, you name it. They want flexibility and they also want to make an impact. And so we have this force up against us, which is we're going to be in a much, much, much worse recession. We have out of control inflation. And so a lot of times our prices have doubled. And when it comes to talent, there's also been inflated wages that most of you startup small businesses, if you're not sitting in Silicon Valley, you literally can't compete at a salary basis, and that's okay. That's going to be your biggest strength going forward. And so I really, really just want to call out the fact that you can be anywhere in the world and compete against any company in the world. And when I started this journey in 2016, it really was, hey, we have Silicon Valley talent. Now, who cares, right? It's literally who cares about where the talent is. There's the technology to find the best possible talent for you if you think creatively about it. So I just want to make sure I emphasize that. And that's part of why kind of I'm so happy to be in Savannah, is because you can live wherever in the world you want and still compete.